Hello and welcome to World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, Panama has broken diplomatic ties with Taiwan in favor of the Chinese mainland. Will this reversal have repercussions on either side of the Taiwan Strait? Markets brace themselves as the U.S. Federal Reserve is on track to raise interest rates by 0.25%. Should U.S. trade partners like China worry about this interest hike? Panama, a Latin American nation located at the crossroads of North and South America, has established diplomatic relations, formal one, with China. Recognizing the One China policy, Panama joined many countries in severing its ties with Taiwan. It is also the second country to do so after Taiwan leader Tsai Ing-wen took office in May of last year.
A new beginning. Panamanian President Juan Carlos Varela has announced that his country and China have established diplomatic relations. He also stressed the historic ties between the two countries goes back more than 160 years.
Me dirijo a la nación el día de hoy.
I address the nation today to announce that we have made a decision to establish diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China.
The foreign ministers of China and Panama signed a joint communique on the establishment of diplomatic ties in Beijing after Panama broke its ties with Taiwan. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi called the signing a historic moment. China, the second biggest user of the Panama Canal, and the Chinese cargo carrier, COSCO Shipping Panama, became the first ship to pass through the newly expanded Panama Canal last year. And the trade volume between China and Panama came to $6.5 billion in 2016. Panama is the second country after Sao Tome and Principe to switch its recognition to the Chinese mainland after Taiwan leader Tsai Ing-wen took office in May of last year. Taiwan Affairs Office of the State Council responded by saying that the diplomatic ties follow the will of the people in both China and Panama.
It's international consensus that there is only one China in the world. The establishment of diplomatic relations between China and Panama are caused with the will of the people and represents an irresistible trend.
Earlier, Varela said Panama was upgrading its commercial ties with China. Wang Yi added that China welcomes Panama's participation in the Belt and Road Initiative, where the two countries will engage on various aspects of trade, investment, maritime affairs, and tourism. The two countries also committed to promoting peace, stability, and development in international and regional affairs between China and Latin America, as well as the Caribbean.
For more on Panama ties with China, we are joined here in our Beijing studio, Zhong Ho Tao, who is a researcher in Taiwan Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences here in Beijing. Welcome to our program.
Thank you.
In Taipei, we are joined by Ms. Joanna Lei, former legislator and also head of the research at the Chenghua 21st Century think tank. Welcome as well. I want to begin with you, Mr. Zhong. Many believe China has become, quote, very aggressive in the past year in terms of establishing diplomatic relations with countries who have already got diplomatic partnerships with Taiwan. How would you respond?
I think it's improper to use the phrase being aggressive. Maybe it is better to say that Chinese mainland it's not necessary for Chinese mainland to keep self-restraint. You know, in the past, in Ma Ying-jeou administration, and that time, Chinese mainland was quite cautious, was quite self-restrained. And that time, one of Taiwan's diplomatic partner named Gambia broke its relationship with Taiwan in 2013. But until 2016, did it set a very formal relationship with China. So it lasted for 3 years.
I see.
At that time, you could see Chinese mainland was very cautious. It did not want to hurt Taiwan authority. It did not want to hurt cross-strait relationship. But now the situation has changed.
How?
And Tsai Ing-wen does not accept 1992 consensus, so it's unnecessary for Chinese mainland to keep self-restraint, I think.
Let's go to Ms. Lei, joining us in Taipei through Skype. Ms. Lei, exactly what is 1992 consensus? Explain to our international viewers, particularly who have not followed the issue. And secondly, what would this mean for relation by Panama with Taiwan for Ms. Tsai's administration authorities now in Taiwan?
1992 consensus documented a historical meeting during which both sides expressed their intention to work together as well as their sovereignty claim. So 92 consensus is a very creative construct that has certain ambiguity built into it so that both sides can maintain certain positions. Built on that creative construct, allowing certain ambiguity, we have been achieving great discussions across Taiwan Straits, especially between KMT and CPC. Between the parties, putting aside the sovereignty claims, allowing the two sides to sign trade pacts as well as administrative cooperations, recognizing each other's official positions in certain areas. And those are the 8 years documented by Ma Ying-jeou's term. After Tsai Ing-wen took office, there has been a very clear question to her, that is whether she will maintain the position as well as maintain the cross-strait relations. Since Tsai Ing-wen refused to answer directly on this creative construct that is ambiguous, mainland China seems to be giving her tests which are more and more clear. Now, in all the severance of diplomatic ties we see in the communique, they are very clearly in terms of positioning mainland China as the sole representative of the whole China, the position that Taiwan is the inalienable part of the whole of China, as well as asking those countries to not only sever the relationship, but also undertake not to build future official relationship.
Right.
These four positions are extremely clear, much more clear than the 92 consensus.
I see. Panama, as you may know, is the 12th country that cut ties with Taiwan since the year 2000. And most of them switched the recognition to the People's Republic of China, the PRC, while some were switching back and forth between Beijing and Taiwan for years before finally setting ties with the Chinese mainland. After Panama's reversal, Taiwan's allies, so-called, expected a domino effect as they think of the remaining countries might also follow suit. Having said that, though, Ms. Lei in Taipei, we have heard about the checkbook diplomacy, or for Ms. Tsai, it's called steadfast diplomacy. Whatever it's called, it means Taiwan authorities are willing to bring out the cash to win a recognition coming from different countries. So will that work once we see some of the examples recently?
Well, I think the international space was created through goodwill and friendship and mutual respect across Taiwan Straits. Without that, we could easily go back to a position that Taiwan had no international relations. Tsai Ing-wen have asked for greater participation in the international community, but now it seems to be extremely clear that without the friendship or goodwill from mainland China, Taiwan's international space will be squashed. And even in the non-diplomatic areas, such as WHA, we've experiencing lots of setbacks. So whatever Tsai Ing-wen plans to do, she'll have to resolve one major issue, that is how to regain the trust, friendship, and goodwill among people across Taiwan Straits, especially from mainland China.
But, you know, Mr. Zhong, the fair question should be also asked to the Chinese mainland. Is China practicing dollar diplomacy by bringing out the cash and win so-called the hearts and minds?
No, I don't think Chinese mainland is playing dollar diplomacy. It is just the Panama made this decision just because of its own interest. If Panama could set a very formal relationship with China, then it could attract more investment from China, and the trade volume between the two countries would increase dramatically. And this undoubtedly will bring great benefits for the Panama development. So I don't think it is the dollar diplomacy is playing. It is just because of Panama's its own interest.
Some even say, Mr. Zhong, I still need your answer about this from the mainland's perspective. That Taiwan, of course, is a very developed economy for decades,
yes.
But China is certainly on its upswing in terms of economic development, international links, and even playing some kinds of international leadership when it comes to international governance. But then Taiwan will never be able to compete with the mainland when it comes to this fiscal and monetary power. And therefore, Taiwan is forever on the weaker party. side. How would you comment about these kind of arguments?
Yes, one is much stronger, for Chinese mainland, and the other for Taiwan is becoming much weaker. So the two sides is on an unbalanced partnership. But I think this is not about a comparison between the two sides. It is about the international trend. And there are almost 200 countries have already recognized one China principle and set a formal relationship with China.
You mean 200 countries?
Yes, 200 countries. So I think Panama is just following this international trend.
Having said that, though, Ms. Lei, how do you see, from the Taiwan perspective, the mainland's approach right now? On the one hand, it seems to be very hard-lined, as some describe, toward the Tsai Ing-wen administration, the Taiwan authorities right now. But on the other hand, seem to ardently even go beyond what they used to do to support this people-to-people kinds of exchanges and business ties and economic ties. Will they work?
Well, it is really clear that Taiwan will have to be able to live well with its major neighbor and major partner. Whether you have different political positions or belonging to different parties in Taiwan, people have a consensus that the status quo, which is peace and development, is the best route for Taiwan. Now, if we look at countries like Panama, it is not because of the dollar that they're making a choice. It is actually they're choosing between a US-dominated Central and South America and a Central and South America which has another alternative offered by co-development and cooperations, infrastructure investments by PRC, by mainland China. So I think it is very clear that those countries make a decision to build a new 21st century. If we, on the side of Taiwan, doesn't take an opposition view towards the rise of China, the mainland China's political might and economic might should be welcomed as an opportunity that we can all build a better world. So the challenge is how to overcome the ideological hurdle still plaguing the place in Taiwan.
Well, you are saying the challenge is like that, but for the ruling party in Taiwan, probably challenge is another thing. It's a political crisis. And therefore, Mr. Zhong, is it possible that the Tsai Ing-wen Taiwan Authority of this generation likely to be pushed or felt being pushed into a corner and even have more extreme actions and rhetorics as a result regarding the issue of cross-strait relations? Mr. Zhong, very briefly from you.
I think we should not exclude this kind of possibility. In 2002, when a country broke its relationship with Taiwan, then Taiwan declared two states theory. So it's a very horrible experience. So we should be very quite cautious about this kind of
Do you think the mainland is ready about all kinds of possibilities?
Yes, I'm sure.
All right. Ms. Lei, what about a comment from you about that?
Well, I think you are right in pointing out that there are two forces pulling Tsai Ing-wen. On the one hand, people are telling her, I told you so. If you don't recognize 92 consensus, things will get worse. The other part says, well, I told you so too. Because if you try to appease mainland China by maintaining the terms, such as calling it mainland China and not PRC, you will not get what you have hoped to get. So this second positions is pulling her to a more extremist position. And a lot of people are now arguing that she should actually push the Taiwan independence agenda even harder and even faster.
Joanna Lei, former legislator and head of the research at the Changhua 21st Century think tank in Taipei. Thank you so much, Ms. Lei, for joining us. Thank you, really appreciate it. And of course, Mr. Zhong will be staying with us for the next part of the discussion. You're watching World Insight with Tian Wei coming to you live on CGTN. We continue our discussion about the establishment of diplomatic relations between and China. Still with us here, once again, we have Mr. Zhong Ho Tao, who is a researcher with the Taiwan Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. And in Shanghai, we have Charles Tang, who is the president of the Brazil-China Chamber of Commerce and Industry. He's also the chair of Paraguay-China Chamber. Paraguay is the only now South American country to recognize Taiwan diplomatically. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. What a discussion earlier. And now let's move on as to what are the relationship like for South American countries and China. We invite Mr. Tang. You are working in Brazil, you're working in Paraguay. What do you think is really behind the mentality change for Panama this time?
Well, we've heard the Chinese perspective and we heard the Taiwanese perspective. What I would like to present is a perspective from a country like Paraguay, which has no diplomatic relations with China, but our Paraguay-China Chamber has an official decree signed by the President of Paraguay and approved by the Congress of Paraguay. So, when I first set up the conference of how China can benefit Paraguay and its companies, there was, of course, resistance from the Taiwanese diplomats. But I think that, I made it very clear that our chamber is basically dedicated to developing business and building a bridge of friendship, and we're not involved in politics. However, from the Paraguayan perspective, many of the politicians, many of the leaders, and all of the business enterprises would like to have a much closer relationship with China. We have to understand that this is a rapidly changing world. China is taking on a very strong leadership role in the world. And not only that, but China's footprints around the world has been prosperity and development. China does not waste its blood or treasure. It sends its business people to trade and to invest. So countries like Paraguay need railways, need subways, need sewage treatment, water treatment, transmission lines, etc. So I believe that there is a very, very strong current in Paraguay, much like in other countries of Central America and Africa and so on that recognize Taiwan, that they would not like to be left out.
Paraguay is one case study.
From
of course,
this
Panama is a different case study. They have chosen, at this point, a different decision. But coming back to the issue of Panama, because that's the focus of our discussion today, that is, Ms. Zhong, 8 billion US dollars Chinese investment from the mainland in Panama.
Yes.
Without diplomatic relations, what would that mean?
If there is no formal relationship between China and Panama, then those investments from China will not be legally protected, then they would suffer great risk. So the two sides should set up a formal relationship, and in this way, I think Panama would attract more investment from China, not only just about 8 billion US dollar, maybe 10 billion or even much more, I think.
Mr. Tang, it is not just Panama, but rather a lot of the South American countries with the earlier initiative coming originally from China, Belt and Road. There seems to be a lot of enthusiasm for connectivity, for linking up the economic and trade, more exchanges between people to people. It seems that something of an unprecedented scale is going to happen. So at this critical juncture, how can you help us to understand the mentality of countries in South America in terms of what kind of relationship they want to build with China? And in terms of how do they weigh and balance their previous diplomatic relations with some of the players also in this part of the world?
Well, some people from South America or Latin America, want development. They want prosperity. They want to see their countries evolve. And basically, like I said, China is helping so many countries around the world to transform Africa from a lost continent to a continent of hope. Latin America and Caribbean, the backyard of the United States under the Monroe Doctrine, is really planting a Chinese garden because China is investing. China is helping the countries to develop and to prosper. And the people all over the world, including Central America and South America, admire the speed that China was able to achieve its, let's say, fantastic economic development, and they would like to share in it. They would like to come to China and see more of it. We would like to bring Paraguayan business people and political leaders to come and visit China so they can see for themselves.
I understand political fights about that in Paraguay, for example. Mr. Tang, is quite severe about which side to take and to work with whom for the future. But there's also one element, Mr. Zhong, that Mr. Tang earlier mentioned. It's crucial as well, that it is the United States. We understand the U.S. has been having certain kinds of links with Taiwan for decades over the history. So what about now? Of course, U.S. commit to one China policy, but there seems to be ups and downs of that commitment.
Yes, the U.S. and the Taiwan relationship, just as you said, is experiencing up and downs. Just several months ago, the new leader of Trump even said the president of Taiwan called in this way to call Tsai Ing-wen, but then just in a short time he changed dramatically, and then he said he would honor one China policy. I think in future the United States will still take Taiwan as a bargaining chip for the China and the U.S. relationship. It will continue to take Taiwan as chess on the Sino and U.S. relationship. It will sincerely to help Taiwan. It just want to take it, but just a bargaining chip.
As a bargaining chip, what would that mean for Latin and American countries and South American countries, Mr. Tang, if the U.S. Once again takes on the issue of Taiwan to use as a bargaining chip toward China?
I think that the United States no longer controls its backyard. It no longer controls the South American, Latin American countries and the Caribbean, especially under Donald Trump. We can see Mexico branching out to create other alliances. We know that the Workers' Party in Brazil took Brazil and several other South American countries, away from the total alignment with the United States. I think that each country has to look after its own interests. And, countries have interests and not necessarily only friendship. So as long as China is the economic locomotive of the world and is willing to invest to develop these countries,
right,
you will see more and more countries coming to China's side, only because of their national interests. I believe that we will see countries like Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, even Paraguay, reevaluating its situation and saying, gee, China with one investment can double our GDP. But Paraguay GDP is only $29 billion. Right. China over the last 3 years has invested much more than that into Brazil, for example.
That's true. Having said that, my last question for you, Mr. Zhong. Of course, connectivity, trade and economic links, crucial. Panama, there is also something called Panama Canal. So not just political issues, but also economic and trade issues. Will there be much possibility of a conflict between China and the United States as more South American countries developing more closer ties with the mainland?
Yes, maybe just as the United States take South Latin American countries as its backyard, so maybe the United States and China relationship will become much more complicated for this issue. But I think the general trend for Sino and U.S. relationship is very healthy. So we don't have to be much worried for the future development for these two countries' development.
I see. We'll see what's going to happen. Zhong Ho Tao, Charles Tang, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. You're watching World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live on CGTN, still to come on our program. Markets embrace themselves as the U.S. Federal Reserve is on track to raise interest rates by 0.25%, some say. Should U.S. trade partners like China worry about this interest rate hike? or actually think otherwise? Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. The U.S. Federal Reserve Chair Janet Yellen is expected to announce the committee's decision on a new interest rate on Wednesday, which is likely to see a hike, some say. Meanwhile, the American economy has been slowing down, failing to meet projections in employment rate, average salary, and GDP. A quarter percentage point rise on Wednesday would be the second nudge upwards this year, following a similar move in the month of March.
As the saying goes, it appears to be baked in the cake. America's central bank is widely expected to raise interest rates this week for the second time this year. The CME Fed Watch tool gives over a 95% probability for a hike, and a Reuters poll showed expectations of the Fed pushing rates up by 25 basis points to 1 to 1.25%.
I think we can take a rise in interest rates as pretty much guaranteed. After all, the Federal Reserve has told us as plainly as it can.
But markets will be eager to see whether Fed policymakers reaffirm a tentative plan for another rate increase later this year, despite low inflation. Predictions for core PCE inflation in 2017, the measure the Fed watches closely, have been cut to their lowest since polling began for this period more than 2 years ago. It's expected to rise between 1.5% and 1.7% each quarter this year, below the Fed's 2% goal.
Well, I'm sure they're a little bit frustrated because they've been saying it's almost 2%, almost 2 years or something like that. But as they pointed out in the most recent minutes, there are various special situations going on, oil prices ripple up and down. There are a lot of other factors in there.
There's also some expectations that the Fed may announce how it will reduce its $4.5 trillion balance sheet, all those things it bought during periods of stimulus, as it seeks to normalize policy nearly a decade after the global financial crisis began, a move that's likely to push up long-term rates.
So what is going to be the impact of the Fed rate decision? Our panelists weigh in Beijing, Professor Liu Baocheng Din with the Center for International Business Ethics from the University of International Business and Economics. Joining us in New York City is Max Wolf, a professor of economics from the New School University in New York and also market strategist from 55 Capital Partners. Gentlemen, welcome to both of you. Professor Wolf, interest rate hike? Really? Professor Wolf?
Yeah, I don't think this is going to be one of the great surprises when we expect this to come this afternoon local time. Yep, we don't expect a great surprise here when the interest rate hike goes into effect this afternoon.
That's true. So this is going to be, Professor Wolf, the last of the so-called stimulus package coming from the U.S. Central Bank to bring up the growth of the economy. This is going to be one of those moments that you see stimulus policies are not necessarily important anymore for the U.S. economy, is it?
Well, I think that might be what some folks hope for. I'm not sure the economy is quite as strong as those predictions had supported previously. We've seen some pretty weak numbers. So one is we really haven't gotten sustained or meaningful wage issue because the kind of big pain of the Great Recession that began in the United States in 2008 is still in effect in many households and many regions. And the only way we'll begin to see that is with better wage growth. We've had employment growth, which is good, but the employment growth hides the fact that there's a lot of people have exited the workforce altogether, so we don't count them. So we still have a good amount of pain out there. We still have a lot of stimulus. I think the bigger question for the Federal Reserve and what will be the concern that people pay attention to is, are they still going to do 2 more rate hikes this year? And what are they going to do about that balance sheet? How quickly do they start to draw down, maybe make a meaningful reduction from the $4.5 trillion in assets now toward a significantly lower number in the next few years?
Those are terrific questions, but maybe it could be helpful if we take a look at some of the latest history about how the Federal Reserve has been acting over the months and years. How has the Fed changed the mechanics of the monetary policy? The Fed has successfully carried out 3 rate increases. Can they now effectively control interest rates without draining the reserves? That question was also being raised by Professor Wolf. For now, Professor Liu, what do you make of it?
Well, actually, they look at three dimensions, whether the economy can really be steered on a steady growth, however slow it might be, but it won't really be reversed. Number two is that whether inflation can really reach the target of 2%, because they believe that this is the best leverage point, and also the unemployment rate. So it's really, I do very much agree with Professor Wolf that the picture is rather mixed, because the economic growth is not that high, and also there is also a signal of reversal. The pay raise is not really as high as expected, and also a lot of temp jobs are really worrisome. People do have jobs, but they worry what's next after 2 months or 3 months of term employment. And then, the inflation. So inflation is rather resilient, but you also notice another signal that the trade imbalance is getting widened. So there's pretty much a mixed signal.
It is mixed signal, particularly politically, Professor Wolf. It is no secret that Washington right now is having a huge dogfight after President Trump comes into the office. That, of course, brings a lot of unpredictability and instability, the growth expectation of the U.S. economy, particularly some of the key economic policies will not be able to be decided now, not to mention implemented. So, Professor Wolf, at this point, what do you think should be the role of the Federal Reserve? How do you, as an economist, expect them to react and act?
So it's a great question. I think the Federal Reserve sees itself as sane, steady, and consistent in an economic policy environment that's unfortunately not sane, not steady, and not consistent. So being relatively more stable, more predictable, is even more important for the Federal Reserve now than normally, because of the political unpredictability of the present group in Washington and of what they're going to achieve. So normally we have some visibility on fiscal policy. The Trump government has been bold in making pretty massive suggested changes to international relations, tax structures, and basic regulation of many, many sectors of the U.S. economy. However, it seems to have dimming prospects of success, and it's hard to know how those policies would pass through. So the consistency of monetary policy becomes more important when it's the one stable thing to hold on to as the fiscal policy ship rocks in these winds. And so I think we're going to see an even more cautious Federal Reserve, with one question mark, which is before his term is out, President Trump may have put 5 of his people, we saw the first 2 come already, onto the Federal Reserve, and he may have the ability to change the composition of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors as well.
So how is that likely to change, the mentality of the Federal Reserve, particularly decision makers coming from different parts of the United States, to make that decision? Professor Liu, it's no secret. The tax cuts, infrastructure building, the trade of these issues need enormous amount of political capital and energy. And of course, Washington just cannot afford it right now, given what is happening right now. So, Professor Liu, what would this mean for one of the United States' biggest trading partner, China?
Well, whether they really
I heard
have...
alongside.
That's right. That's a very difficult question, but a very good question, though. Yes, the world is really living in a very complex system where the change of one portion can really create a bigger ripple on the other. Given that the 2 largest economies interacting and counteracting in many ways, so China is looking at, well, number one, whether we are able to maintain at least the 6% growth rate, and whether we are going to really keep our currency more stable, and then whether we are able to really take a chance if the United States is there to roll out programs like the infrastructure construction. And then, whether China is going to take better leadership in regional integration so that more productivity can be unleashed by working more with neighbors.
Yeah.
So it's really a counteractive situation. So I think from the Chinese elite circle, much is really there to be sitting and see, to be more reactive rather than taking active measures, because we are not really able to see, actually nobody is able to see what is really clearly lying ahead in the political landscape in the United States at the moment.
Nobody can see it clearly. That is a very frank and insight that you just had. But, Professor Wolf, people do see the opportunities. The opportunities at least go with the states, different states, individual states, they have their own trade and economic promotion policies. It also goes with the business community inside the United States, the community of innovation, new technologies as well. How much do you think the mentality and also the energy there will be able to help the U.S. trade partners to be more courageous in promoting more cooperation with the United States, even amid all of these political fights?
Yeah, so it's a very good question. I think we saw, particularly around the United States' somewhat rogue decision to be among a very few number of states to reject the Paris Climate Accord, that many cities and states, some regions of the country, and most of our leading international businesses have decided to honor those agreements, even if they are honoring them as a state or a city or a corporation, as opposed to a part of a U.S. governmental effort to honor that agreement. So I think we have a bit of a case study in what may be done. The problem with this being that the federal government asserts a lot of influence, both legally and also in terms of global opinion. And part of what I think American businesses and the global business community and the nation's states around the world are trying to figure out is, what is the United States doing? Because we often, not only are some of the signals from our present government a departure from what past governments have done, they're new. There's also a bit of ambiguity because we sometimes see folks in and around the Trump government, including President Trump himself, articulate one policy only to articulate a diametrically opposed policy maybe 24, 36, 72 hours later. So there's a amount of unsettledness here, which is unusual. I do think that states and cities will try to pick up the mantle, and whether the federal government will allow them to function that way is something we're waiting to see.
At the same time, Professor Liu, just to add to the complexity of the whole issue, you see the business community also is going through some transformation. We heard about new unicorn companies like Uber going through some challenges right now. It is quite a representative of that generation of the new and high-tech companies. Meanwhile, you also heard companies like GE, the longtime CEO has stepped down, even though he still remains the chairman of the board. So you see these dramatic changes in businesses inside the United States, many of them conglomerates, multinationals, also on many of the economies around the world. What do you make from this perspective?
Well, I think for the U.S. leaders, I do need to give credit to the previous President Obama, that he really sees that there has been a general hollowing out of the U.S. industry, which is really the fundamental issue for the U.S. economy. And now I also need to give credit to Donald Trump, noticing that the infrastructure is really dragging the feet for further growth in the United States. And right now, whether they're really looking at a long-term view by navigating into the difficult, course, or whether they are going to have a quick fix. Yes, everyone is there to agree that there needs to be a tax reform, there needs to be health care reform, but so far none has really achieved to the general satisfaction of the political parties and also the general folks. And lastly, I think how to navigate the international relationship is the United States. They are really retreating from global leadership, or are they really going to present certain other format? So that's something that still remains to be seen.
Professor Liu, I thought you were going to give me some answers, but you give me more questions than the answer themselves. But certainly, I guess that is the reality of our world today. For now, I want to thank the two of you, gentlemen, for being with us. Professor Liu Baocheng from China, Professor Max Wolf from the United States. Really appreciate it. Thank you. That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight with Tianwei CGTN in your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo as well. From me, Tianwei, and everyone on World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again tomorrow for insights across China and around the world. Good night.